Welcome back to the channel, everyone. What a phenomenal Worlds it was. So many fun games. It's been nice to finally have a moment to kind of take a step back because while Worlds is happening, so much is happening and you're planning for the next thing. You can't really have time to analyze what's already happened. And so now is really our chance to kind of go back and figure out what did we actually learn from this Worlds, what interesting things happened, and how can we use what we learned to maybe help us in the next Worlds and just help us be better analysts in general. Before next Worlds, I'll be analyzing a lot of LCK and LPL content on this channel, and we'll use what we learned here to make that analysis better. Starting with the crystal ball, we did insanely well. We were placed 7,200, so very close to being top 5,000, especially when you consider that we didn't pick who the winner would be. The team that wins Worlds gives you 100 points, which is more than any other category. So considering that we didn't pick that right, we did incredibly well. It was a very mild Worlds overall, not super exciting in terms of these stats, like pentakills were low, Baron steals were relatively low. I was one of the people who was skeptical whether Jinx would actually be coming back into the meta, and that's why I chose the lower end of the pentakills, but clearly not low enough because there were actually 0 pentakills at all of Worlds, which is pretty insane. Poppy popped off just like we expected it to. This Cassante, who will be picked most, I think everyone got this wrong. We can see here that on this crystal ball spreadsheet, Cassante was far and away the most popular choice for most picked. So we were not the only one who got trolled by that. I don't know exactly why Cassante fell out of the meta. I don't know if pros think that he has a really bad matchup against Jax or Gnar or both, but because the top lane was so dominated by Jax and Gnar, it crowded Cassante out. I did predict that the top lane would be very stale, and it was this Worlds. We have Jax, Gnar, Rumble, Renekton, Cassante, and that's it. The top lane was basically 5 champions this entire tournament. I thought Cassante would be the most picked of them, but people just too tempted by the Jax and Gnar. Both of them were buffed on the Worlds patch, and both of them were already pretty good champions, so it makes sense that they were both very popular. One other factor pushing these high damage top laners, Jax and Gnar, might have been low damage in the other lanes, like Ahri mid lane, Jhin bot lane, Ashe bot lane was very popular. If you have these kind of more utility, low damage mid and bot laners, then you're going to get a lot more value out of those high damage top laners like the Gnar and Jax. Maybe the Cassante is not quite enough damage in a lot of those comps when you have utility in the other roles. Before Worlds, Skarner was just kind of being ignored by most regions, so that would have been super hard to predict. Jax is generally just really unpopular outside of those eastern regions, so kudos if you predicted that. I never would have predicted that. And then Rel, I think, is the most reasonable of these three that one could have predicted. Rel was extremely popular before Worlds, but betting a champion who just got nerfed on the Worlds patch to be the most picked, you'd have to be pretty confident about that. So that was a very hard prediction to make. We got in the same trouble here with most banned when the entire top lane became Jax and Gnar. Renekton was kind of out of the meta, and so he was not really picked or banned nearly as much as he was in the regular season where he was banned a ton. Ashe was on my list, but she got nerfed the patch right before Worlds, so I was a little nervous about it. Nerfs didn't hit her hard enough, and she was still a huge threat. Yone, I think a lot of people predicted this one. I would have never predicted this one in a million years because I don't think the champion's that good, and I especially don't think that most teams can play it. Like, who you realistically need to ban Yone against? Faker, Knight, Chovy, and Zeka pretty much. Like, no one else can really play Yone, and you could kind of see that this tournament, that even in the games where Yone won, if it wasn't one of those 4 players I just mentioned, he looked pretty like mediocre most of the time. So I really don't know why so many teams banned it against teams who are not one of those top 4 or 5, but it's undeniable that he was a huge part of the meta and took up a huge amount of bans. Whether I think it's stupid that he did doesn't matter, right? Players who predicted this accurately picked up on the perception of teams and coaches that this pick was going to be a huge threat across a huge variety of teams, not just a couple of teams. Aurora, similar thing where I would have never predicted this because I don't think the champion's that strong, but the perception was that it's extremely broken among many teams, and just the fact that it's a new champ, maybe next tournament, if there's a new champ, we'll be a little more willing to consider that as an option because some people just don't want to deal with it. Even if it's not that strong, they don't know how to deal with it. They're not prepared for it. And so it definitely makes sense to put more weight onto a champ that's new when you're trying to decide who you should pick for most banned. For most stats, I was deciding between Cassante and Rel, and I thought Cassante would be picked a lot more than Rel. Cassante having about 3 deaths per game on average, which is comparable to many of the supports. So as long as he's picked like at the same amount as Rel or maybe 20% more, he should have had more deaths. Rel also had, though, an absurd amount of deaths this game. Rel had 4 deaths per game, which was much more than the 3 deaths per game that she had in last year's tournament. I don't know exactly what caused this. Leona also having almost 4 deaths per game, higher than usual. So these engaged champs just really playing more aggressive this tournament than they played in the last tournament, which is raising their average deaths per game. This might mean that moving forward, we put more weight on the engaged supports and really kind of dial back on predicting top laners or junglers for most deaths, but you need to know that they'll be picked a lot. Who will have the highest win rate? I picked Ornn, and Ornn did have a 100% win rate. Granted, it was only a single game, but I actually didn't realize when I did Crystal Ball that you get points for second and third place. I don't think it would have changed much. The fact that you get points down to third place means that you really want to pick someone here who you're actually confident is going to get 5 games. I was like 70% sure that Ornn would get 5 games, but maybe I should have picked someone who I was 95% sure they'd get that 5 games. Who will play the most different champions at Worlds? This one's so hard to predict. I picked Delight because he was picking tons of different champions before Worlds, but then as soon as Worlds came along, he really locked into that Rel and kind of broke the pattern that he was having. The winner was Knight, and that would have been a very hard thing to predict because he was the opposite way. Here in the summer, he's locking in almost all Yone and Tristana, only 8 different champions. Here in the summer playoffs, almost all Corki, only 4 different champions, and then him breaking the pattern in the other direction, playing tons of different champions at Worlds. So that would have been a very hard prediction to make, so good job if you got that one right. Winners here are mid laner, jungler, bot laner, support. Teams that going further, of course, getting more champions played, that was in our analysis, but every single lane, I think this is just a super hard category to predict. I don't know if we did anything super wrong here. Here, I'm very proud of myself. In my video, I said, these seem like they're all really highly correlated, and it turned out they were very highly correlated, that if a player gets a lot of first bloods, they'll probably have a high KDA, they'll probably get a lot of kills in a game. Everyone got this one wrong because there were no pentakills at Worlds. PSG was a solid pick here. Which team will win the shortest game? This one, I don't know if there's any way of predicting. We don't see any discernible pattern here. This was in the Swiss stage. It wasn't even in the play-ins. And then in the Swiss stage, like Mad Lions is not that good. Top Esports is very good. TL is not that good. T1 is very good. So I don't know if there's too much to learn from this one. It seems like another ultra hard category. BLG seems like it was a fine choice. T1 with the most Baron steals, we predicted they would be a very chaotic team, and they were. That worked out well for us. Which team will win Worlds? I think this was a fine prediction given how weak T1 was before the tournament started and that BLG made it to the finals. And which team will play the most different champions? BLG, their players all play a lot of different champions, and they were predicted to go very far, so that one made sense, and that one paid off for us. Here in Pick'ems, we were doing really well in the play-ins. I think Pain Gaming getting through was just a fluke, so it's not like we need to update our methodology in a way that would have caught Pain Gaming. That would be overfitting the data. Swiss, our strategy of picking 8 Eastern teams worked super well. Predicting FlyQuest and not GTU wouldn't have made any sense. BLG, it was necessary because there's a high chance that BLG plays, say, Gen G in the 1-0 bracket or the 2-0 bracket. So if you truly believe that BLG is going to win the whole tournament, which is what we thought, you kind of have to believe that they're going to beat Gen G, which means you kind of have to put them over Gen G to go undefeated. So this pick was totally consistent with the other picks that we made. And I don't think we should have put Gen G here given the information that we had available. Quarterfinals, the majority got it wrong, predicting LNG and HLE. This one was my most controversial pick, but if anything, I think that what played out this year kind of showed that T1's doesn't have a unique buff against LPL because Gen G crumbled just as hard against T1 and they're an LCK team, and BLG played perfectly well in the finals. BLG didn't really underperform in finals, and T1 didn't really overperform in finals. They were just like very perfectly matched, and T1 happened to come out on top. So while none of the crazy T1 fans have convinced me that T1 has a quarterfinals buff or a LPL buff, I do think there might be some merit to the statement that says T1 is less likely than other teams to choke at high-profile events, whether it's MSI or Worlds. Less likely, right? That doesn't mean that they never choke. It doesn't mean that other teams always choke. It just means that they might be a tad less likely to choke. In a case like this, even if that were in my data set, I would have said, okay, T1's a little less likely to choke than TES, but I also think TES is a little bit better, and I might have picked the same team anyway. But I definitely will, moving forward, at MSIs and at Worlds and LCK finals and stuff, use the fact that I do think T1 is slightly less likely to choke than all other teams, LPL, LCK, LEC, when I'm making these predictions. The one thing I do regret is not the predictions I made themselves, but I think that I didn't properly state to the audience how close all of these matches are. When you're at Worlds, when you've been traveling, when it's a new meta, that shifts all of these matchups closer to 50-50. And I just wish I had done a better job telling the audience that, like, okay, maybe LNG winning is 60-40 or 55-45, closer to 50%. Semifinals, totally reasonable to pick Gen G and saying that only 25% picked them. And then finals, totally reasonable to pick BLG, about 50-50 chance. And only 11% picked them is crazy. I mentioned briefly in my other video, but it can actually be really favorable for your pick'ems to bet against T1 if you believe that they're overhyped, because like if we had gotten this right, we would have shot ahead of 90% of the people. And so when your reward is based on your ranking, you actually do get a benefit picking a team that's less hyped up. Obviously, you don't want to pick a team for no justification, but in a case like this, you're getting so much value for your wager, because obviously BLG's chance of winning that game was higher than 12%, right? Unrelated to pick'ems and crystal ball, there are some other important things to take away from Worlds. On my tier list for pro, I had Gragas in my highest tier, Galio in my second highest tier, and I had Skarner in my highest tier. And I think all three of those champions were really vindicated. They showed how strong they are in pro play. Yes, Gragas and Galio have high win rates, but I always say win rate data means nothing. But you could just see in the Gragas and Galio games how effective they were, how much they were contributing to the victory. That's what matters, not the high win rates. And Skarner as well, you just saw how much work he was doing. And this might be controversial, but I also think I was vindicated saying Yone would underperform at Worlds. Controversial because he has a high win rate. But if you look into that data, which I can do in another video, it's a lot of good teams playing Yone against bad teams. So it's like whatever mid laner you pick, you're going to win. You could have played a ward and it would have a 70% win rate if it's only good teams playing against bad teams. If you actually take the games that are between two teams of similar skill level, and there is not like a 4K blowout by the time Yone gets Blade of the Rune King in either direction, his win rate is like 50% or 54% or something. And then of that 50-something% win rate, if you look at the game subjectively, many of those games were won with, I think, Yone contributing less than any other mid lane champ would have. Definitely, there were some standout moments where Yone looked incredible. And I think in particular, Zeka, Knight, Faker, and Chovy had great Yone performances. But outside of that, he was pretty underwhelming. You can agree with me or not, but I was paying attention to Yone performances the whole time because obviously I'm very passionate about that champ. There were some other champs that looked pretty bad all tournament, like Ari looked pretty bad most of the time. Jhin looked pretty bad most of the time. Misfortune looked pretty bad most of the time. Akali looked pretty bad most of the time. I might update my tier list if I'm convinced that this was a large enough sample size to really show how weak these champions are in pro play. That'll require some more analysis, but they're kind of on my radar as picks that I was really unimpressed by, no matter kind of whose hands they were in. There were a lot of predictions about Worlds that didn't really come true. Syndra wasn't played that much. LeBlanc wasn't played that much. Jinx wasn't played that much. Lee Sin wasn't played that much. People tend to remember all the things that they knew would happen, like, oh yeah, Yone was going to be a huge part of the meta, but they also thought lots of things would happen that didn't happen, right? So we have to be careful not to have too much 2020 hindsight. This World's meta was just super hard to predict. If we go through the patch notes, like Ari was buffed into the meta, Aurora was nerfed, but she was still 100% ban. Azir was buffed, and he still wasn't played a single time. This one's surprising to me because I think Azir is still great in pro play. Corki was nerfed, and he was barely played at all. Ivern was completely out of existence, just from a small nerf, which is surprising. Jarvan, they couldn't really put into the meta, even buffing him. And yet when they buff Jax, he becomes like the best top laner in the tournament. So hard to predict which of these buffs are going to land. Jace didn't come on at all. Jinx was not relevant at all. Lissandra was not relevant. Lulu was not relevant. Malphite was not relevant. Like Rel, they nerfed, and then she was the most picked champ in the tournament. So it's super hard to predict what the meta is going to be. Same with Rumble, nerfed and still top of the meta. Vi was nerfed, still top of the meta. And then you can't buff Varus or Viego or Xin back into the meta. They were a little more effective nerfing people out of the meta, even though that only worked about half the time. They're trying to buff champions into the meta. That didn't work for almost any champion except maybe Ahri. So the moral there is if there are buffs before Worlds, don't necessarily think that those champs are likely to be part of the meta. If there are nerfs before Worlds, evaluate them one by one, because there's a 50% chance it'll totally knock them out of Worlds, and there's a 50% chance that they could still be the most picked champs at Worlds, like Rumble or whatever. I also definitely think that the metas this spring are going to look very different than this Worlds meta, not because of patch notes, but just because people are learning, how to deal with the Yone. Skarner's a pretty good counter pick. What's effective against the Aurora? Ahri, I think, was kind of a comfort pick for a lot of mid laners under these stressful situations, but probably isn't going to be picked nearly as much during the spring. So I'm optimistic that in the spring, the metas will look different, and it'll be really exciting to see kind of how those changes have come in. I think that's most of the important things from Worlds. I'm sure I'm missing some important stuff. Let me know in the comments what your biggest takeaway from this year's Worlds was, either on the prediction side, Pick'em Crystal Ball, or just in general about League of Legends and the meta moving forward. We've got a lot of great content coming up, so make sure you're subscribed. We're going to make a Champion Tier List 2.0 video where we go through our Champion Tier List and really make sure that everything is in kind of the right place where we like it. Thank you all so much for spending an incredible World season with me, and I will see you all soon.